Dr. Kenneth Womack, it's great to talk to you about the Beatles and, in particular, a topic of the Beatles that doesn't get discussed very much. And I feel like you're closing in a historic gap here that we've had in the story in the work you've been doing on Mal Evans, best known as the Beatles roadie, but I guess he became. What title would you give Mal? Because he started off as in a particular job with the band, but after they stopped touring, he continued on right through to the end.
Sure, he was bouncer, and then he was roadie, road manager, equipment manager, cook, uh, uh, you know, songwriting assistant, jack of all trades, anvil player, right? Friend, confidant. Those are just a few, I think. There are many, many. Fixer. He may have handled the dope bag. It's just possible, perhaps.
He did a very good job of handling the policeman in the Get Back movie that we saw recently.
He did. He sure did.
Yeah, and that was sort of the thing. I mean, I guess every Beatle fan on the planet has watched the Get Back movie from Peter Jackson in recent months, and Mal is one of those people that's always in the movie but always in the background, isn't he?
He really is. And I talk about these kinds of folks a lot. I talked about them before I was engaged on this project. They're the invisible people who make things happen, right? When you look at any artistic enterprise, or I mean, heck, it doesn't have to be art, right? It could be any business or what have you. There are a lot of people behind the scenes that really make some of the things we care about the most go. And Mal was that guy. He worked tirelessly for them. He would do anything and everything. He made great sacrifices. I mean, there was something in it for him, but he made choices because he really believed in what they were doing. And this is true of all art forms, right? I'm also an English professor, and I'm fortunate to be able to talk about people like Charlotte Bronte, right? She didn't write her novels by herself. She stayed up by candlelight working on those great Victorian works, but somebody proofread them, somebody put them into press. There were people who probably corrected them, and in her life who probably helped make changes and reconstructed her views and helped deliver her product, even though she probably wouldn't have called it a product, right, in her day. But there were lots of invisible people always working behind everything. And many of their names get lost to time. We just happen to know this guy because he's really big and he's in a lot of the photos.
So, how did your journey start with going down the rabbit hole of uncovering the Mal Evans story?
So I had no intention of being involved in anything like this. But like I think most Beatles scholars, fans, I've always been curious about Mal, how he died, why he disappears from the story, when he disappears in the first few days of 1976. I knew he was important. I knew he had played an integral role. But my curiosity never took me to some place where I was trying to dig out more information necessarily about him. And actually, right before COVID, his family approached me through a mutual friend, and they said, "What do you think? You want to see what about writing our father's story?" And I thought, well, what about all this stuff, I said, that supposedly exists, right? These diaries and these manuscripts, et cetera. And they said, well, we can send them to you. And I said, well, okay, I think I'd like to see them. So kind of put it out of my mind and went about my business. And I guess about a week later, my wife and I went to the door, and there was this huge box, and it was everything. And at first it was hard to look at because I felt like I shouldn't be looking at it. It was Mal's diaries, his about 2,000 photographs, all sorts of things that I'd never seen, and I suddenly felt too close to it. This was sort of looking behind the curtain at something have studied for almost 50 years. So, it was a little beguiling. to even wrap my arms around it and figure out how to tell the story. But fortunately, I've become really good friends with Gary Evans, Mal's son, who's 60 now. And we really solved those problems together. You know, how do you tell this guy's story, warts and all, so that the world can both understand what happened to him, because people don't seem to when you begin to look out in our World Wide Web or in the print books, but then also capture the nature of his contribution. So fortunately, we figured that out. We landed a press, and here we are today. And I'm talking to Australia. It's all possible.
Yeah. Well, when you say how do you capture the story, you're capturing the story in the words of the man himself, coming directly from his diary. So you don't really have to massage much of this story, I would imagine. The words are all there.
Well, that's true, but I don't think you can provide a round portrait of a person like this who has left hundreds of thousands of words of material. This isn't a little bit of material. It's a lot of material. And I don't think you can tell the story when you have so much raw verbiage and pictures and drawings at times by simply taking it from the horse's mouth. So I've probably conducted 200 hours perhaps of interviews with hundreds of people at this point who are still alive, the surviving folks. One that you've interviewed that I would love to have gotten my hands on would have been Derek Taylor, right? What a dream that must have been. And to be able to approach him with the materials I have in my hands and say, what do you think about this thing that happened at Apple in 1969? What's your perspective? That would have been wonderful. But I've contacted everybody I possibly could to try to get a round picture. But you're right. Part of what makes it exciting is I have the language and the perspective of this guy who's been lost to history for nearly 50 years. About the time I was discovering and falling in love with the Beatles, he was dying, so really for the length of my time of thinking about them, he's been gone. But I do feel like you need to contextualize when you have that much material. You've got to get other perspectives, because otherwise you're just regurgitating and repeating what this one guy said.
When you talk about the death of Mal, it's fact that it was tragic circumstances. He was shot by police. How did he go from such an enormous high with the Beatles to how the circumstances of his death came apart?
Well, fortunately, there'll be a book coming out soon.
Oh, we're not going to give away the ending. Is that it?
No, we're not, because it's probably not what you think. I don't mean to be too tantalizing, but I'm going to be tantalizing. It's a story that plays out in ways I never imagined. Just the sheer understanding of how we have this material is incredible. We probably shouldn't. It should have been destroyed, but yet we do. The story of how he ends up in that bedroom on that day is a complicated one that isn't as simple as a tragedy. So there's a lot to tell, but and in fact, in writing it took me quite a few words, my friend, to tell this story, double what I thought it would, quite frankly, to capture the story. But so much of what is out there, as I think you'll see pretty soon, is wrong about what happened and how it happened. But what I come back to again and again is how much he loved them, and he would have done anything and did do anything and everything for them. You don't have something as amazing as we all do and we possess in the beautiful record albums behind you. We don't have that if it's not for people like Mal and Neil Aspinall and of course Derek Taylor. And a lot of the beauty of being able to write about Mal meant that I went and I learned a lot more about Neil. and the things that traumatized Neil and broke Neil's heart in being part of that journey. It's there's another book that needs to happen, right? I mean, what a gift these folks gave us by being part of it, when I'm sure they had better opportunities with much more acclaim out there for all of the folks who are in that inner circle. I find it pretty extraordinary because the Beatles, as I get to tell my students every fall when I do a Beatles semester, it's they're a miracle. They're a real story. There are tragedies in this story. One guy, Brian, dies very young. Another guy dies young. All of them, George and John die young. One guy's murdered, John, right? I mean, it's a tragic, real story, but at the heart of it is this amazing music. And it was John Lennon who said over and over, including on the last day of his life, when we were all worried about in 1980, when's the Beatles reunion? He said, who cares? You've got this music. And he was right. One thing we've seen over and over again in the post-Beatles world is the music is always the artifact. You come back to that music will never die. And it will be their versions that never die. I mean, it's wonderful to hear a fantastic cover version of a song, but those recordings they're permanent as long as they're human beings and planet Earth.
Exactly, and they did continue on because I recall in the interview that I did with George Harrison where I asked him what would the Beatles have sounded like had they continued into the 70s, and he said, well, just take a song off, one of my albums, off one of John's albums, off one of Paul's albums, put them all together because that's all we were doing at the end anyway. The Get Back story might tell a different story, but at the end of the day, there were different personalities that were coming in, and the compilation happened in the studio. It didn't happen in the songwriting.
That's right. And have you ever seen this bootleg album called Everyday Chemistry?
No.
Well, you and your listeners should check it out. It's really quite lovely. It's and I wish I knew who the compiler producer was, but it's really well done, and it gives you a sense of what you just said and what Mr. Harrison said in that interview with you about what their sound would have been. It was an attempt to capture that. It's really quite marvelous.
So the last 5 years of Mal, the Beatles broke up, and then we, as general public, really didn't hear much of him. He lived in America, I take it, after.
So Mal did not move to the United States until January 1974. He had been spending increasing amounts of time there, including with George Harrison for the most part, and spent a lot of time with George. In his last couple of years, George would regularly call the house where Mal was living. I mean, George, as they all did, instilled great value in Mal. He continued to work for them literally until he's dead. Certainly through the end of the partnership, which I guess officially, John Lennon signs the papers in December 1974, but the partnership doesn't end until sometime in January 1975. Mal Mal never stopped working for them. I don't know how else to put it. And worked on several of the solo albums, as is pretty well known. Worked with Wings for a brief moment in '73 when Paul needed some consultancy on the Wings tour, the one where they had the bus. I guess Mal was a bus specialist, right? After the Magical Mystery Tour bus. I kid because that really wasn't his role, but so he was working with all of them, at one point or another during that period. So, just as George Harrison said, they all went on making their solo projects. Mal went on working with and for them wherever they happened to be. He had a suitcase and he traveled.
There's probably nobody who knows more about the Beatles than you. The number of Beatle books that you have written and published over the years. Does it still astound you that we are still finding out things that we didn't know?
Wow. Yeah, no, it doesn't, because I remember a graduate course I had um, many years ago, and the professor said something that I thought was kind of dopey at the time, because when you're in grad school, you think you know better, you're in grad school now, you got a handle on everything. But the professor, we were talking about writing biography and the telling of literary history, and he said, the best work is told decades after the principals are gone. And I think that's going to be true with the Beatles, because some of these figures who are alive are such iconic people, right? Yoko Ono, who, by the way, is the hero of the Mal Evans story. There's another tantalizing clue for you all. Did you catch on? Did you see how I did that? The glass onion reference? Yeah. Anyway, I think it's true. I think some of these figures loom so large. Paul and Ringo, of course. John, even in death, has loomed very large for a long time, right? Ask Paul McCartney, and sparring with that, with a ghost and these sorts of things. So these are monumental figures, and I think we'll start to see some of the better history from these years forward. I appreciate the compliment about knowing a lot about them. I do spend a lot of time thinking about them every day. But I simply couldn't have done this project or anything without the help of Mark Lewison. Soon as this became part of my world, I began consulting with Mark, sharing whatever I could to help him out, of course, in his incredible work, which is the standard bearer, but also because he's given such a gift to us all. He's one of my great mentors, and just a good friend to everybody who cares about this band like we do. And but I appreciate the compliment, and I do enjoy thinking about them, because I don't know that I will ever solve the problem or the intellectual question that I started with, which is, how do they do this in 7 years, right? How do they go from Love Me Do to August 22nd, 1969 at Tittenhurst Park and create that art? And that's the challenge I present to my students every fall. I don't know that we can adequately answer that question. I can't find anything else like it in art. Shakespeare is wonderful, but Shakespeare is uneven. Shakespeare doesn't have that upward trajectory as they do. Pablo Picasso does not. Virginia Woolf does not. James Joyce does not. Hell, J.K. Rowling does not. So it's extraordinary. And I, as I say to my students, we can learn so much from them, taking down an industry, right, by going sideways at it and pushing it over with these outsiders. Brian, the Beatles, George Martin, who's a big faker, right? He was from the wrong side of the tracks. They push it over. We can learn a lot from them, but at the same time, we can't, because they're such an outlier. You would never compare yourself to them. That's useless.
Yeah.
Pick something else. REO Speedwagon.
Yeah, but I guess the Beatles never came from a period in time where the music industry was wrapped around sales and marketing. These days, their entire career from first album to last, when you compare that to what happens now, from a band releasing their new album today, they would be up to their third album by the time the Beatles broke up.
Sure, and perhaps most importantly, they obviously have the talent and the chutzpah and the personalities to arrest our attention. They've never let it go, for the most part. But they also had no competition, right? In American cities, not all major cities even had all three networks at that time. They really did have they didn't have 24-hour sports, out there colliding with them at every instant. So they were able to elevate themselves and show off this incredible profile, often without competition. So that's bad when you fail, of course. Like on Boxing Day in 1967, everybody could see Magical Mystery Tour in black and white.
Yes, I personally don't consider Let It Be the last album. Abbey Road to me is the last album. I also don't consider Her Majesty the last song. The end was the last song, as far as I'm concerned. And
You would enjoy my class because we end with Abbey Road, and we discuss these things at length.
okay, well, I will sign up one day when I and become one of your students. But what great words that the Beatles ended their career on, and in the end, the love you make is equal to the love you take. It really out philosophizes the Bible, doesn't it?
Coming back to Mal for a moment, one thing that's really rewarding as people will do soon enough, when you study his surviving manuscripts, you see that he too was in the conversations that would produce something like that. He, because of their influence and his own visit to Rishikesh, right? I mean, the most important book to him in the world was Autobiography of a Yogi, and he imbibed it full flower. He too is cut of that cloth. He would never compare himself to them or what they accomplished, but he certainly was a part of that kind of philosophizing and thinking. And it's lovely to see another voice, to hear another voice, I guess, when you read the materials, and I've tried to capture that in the biography, which I have completed. um, it's wonderful to hear people in close proximity to them being able to glean those kinds of values that they shared with us. I mean, Paul said it so well in the anthology, right? They didn't tell us to kill our parents. They told us peace, love. They really stayed on message. They would talk about equal rights for women. They would talk about the plight of the lonely and the impoverished. It's hard not to get behind their story. I mean, really, we never find, there is no, how shall I put it? There is no other shoe that's going to drop. It really was a body of work, as John Lennon put it, right? That they were creating. It's really something quite powerful, which is why it still beguiles me.
Well, we've been talking to Dr. Kenneth Womack, who has uncovered the Holy Grail in the story of Mal Evans, and will tell us a lot about the Beatles that we don't know about over the next 2 years. And just for the sake of the audience, Kenneth, there's 2 books coming out, not one. There's a 2023 project and a 2024 project.
Sure. So the first book is a biography. It is a full-length biography. It is big, like its subject. It is, which was completed, I think, last week. So it is in the hands of the publisher, and then volume 2, which will come out about 9 months later from when they put this book out, will be everything. So Mal had an enormous collection of photographs. I mean, he was a collector, actually. He collected buttons. He collected stamps. He was a great student of the world. So, and he traveled, right, a lot with them. And so what people will get in volume 2 will be everything in a kind of edited fashion, chronologically, so you can experience Mal from beginning to after the end, and because really it's the story, his story is his story told from his point of view. But being able to study those artifacts, as I think people will really enjoy doing, will help open new windows into the songs, the solo careers, where Mal took notes that have already changed how I think about several of those post-Beatles albums. What volume 2 will be then is this kind of omnibus collection of his material.
Well, we look forward to all of that to come. Dr. Kenneth Womack, thank you for your time here at noise11.com.
Thank you so much for having me.